And so it's just being, it sounds silly, sounds crazy, but just dream really big and then being patient on, you don't know how it's going to play out. You don't know how it's going to happen. And it might take 20, 30 years before it happens. But it's just the possibility that it can is always still there.
Welcome to another episode of the Deeper Than Dough podcast. I've got Bennet as co-host, and then today we have Eric Lowe, the CEO and founder of Credo, who has become a really good friend of both of ours, and talking about mental health, some of his background, and talking about saving plants and consciousness. So super excited to dive in and get to know Eric a little bit more. Eric, welcome to the Deeper Than Dough podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I need to start introducing you and when I'm doing my introductions.
I realized that last time. It was just like, no one's going to know because we jump right in.
We do.
Just like,
you're right. He introduced me, but I forget to introduce him. And we're also here with Mike Norton, the best guy in the world.
First time I introduced you, so we're starting something new.
Okay, now we're even.
We're starting something new today.
Let's start with your background, Eric. And Mike knows you a little bit more than I do. Anyways, love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a technical founder. Came from spent a long time in molecular microbiology, where I split my time between academia and then biotech. And then along the way, I was building companies, even though I didn't think I had the entrepreneur bug. So my first one being a recording studio, and that was purely a passion company, right? So that one appeared during college days where, decided I didn't want to be a doctor anymore and walked away from going to med school. And the next thing I wanted to do was become a musician. And so,
smooth transition.
Yep, exactly. And I did that for a couple years. And then all of a sudden I just found myself with a bunch of music equipment and was like, hey, it'd be cool if I had a recording studio. And that happened. And that really was kind of the insight of this kind of manifestation concept, right? And everything in my life has just been crazy since then.
And Eric kind of underplays how smart he is. Also, I want to point out how he called himself a true technical founder, unlike me, who figuring things out as we go. But Eric actually has background in it. But one of the most impressive things that I learned about you that you just never told me, but you worked in a laboratory.
Yes.
I believe, was it an infectious disease laboratory?
So the first one was a pathology lab.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was working on all sorts of different organisms. We did crazy stuff, and some of it is still a little traumatic just because of the things we were doing to animals. But I would take rabbits, harvest white blood cells from their femur, and then keep those in cell culture, and then do more experiments on those. I had glowing mice that were fluorescently tagged. I had glowing fish. We messed around with all sorts of different animal models.
And the reason I bring this up because when I met you at Space Station, I knew you as Eric the musician and Eric as Credo co-founder, not knowing that you were doing all this amazing things in a laboratory, but led up to your story. And I think will be an important part of how you view and you ask questions and a scientific procedure when you're trying to solve things.
Sure. Was there a question there?
Wasn't a question, more
okay.
a statement.
Okay.
More of a
I also
statement.
agree with that statement.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Applying that science of what you do in a lab to business to make sure that you are testing things properly and knowing if, okay, is that an actual test and we should never do that again? Or do we need to repeat the test because of a different variable? I do see a huge value in there because people don't know how to test.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I made the jump to entrepreneurship, I had no background, right? I don't have a business degree. I don't have an MBA. No one in my network knew business. No one in my family knew business. I read the Lean Startup, and that's what we were being taught, right? It's like, oh, the scientific method, running lean. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, that's the magic here. Oh yeah, we understand that. That's core to who we are. And so, yeah, after that, I was like, oh, I think we can figure this business part out. And exactly right. Everything you do in business is just you have a thesis, hypothesis, you test it, you run a couple experiments, you get the data, and you make a decision and you move on.
That's cool. Have you guys seen Guardians of the Galaxy 3?
Just saw it this weekend.
Not yet. I heard there's
he'd be good.
A lot of lab testing, right?
Yes, that's what it had to be. Those are some weird looking animals, but also adorably cute with fake arms.
Actually, that kind of plays into our entire podcast. We'll set the question now. Maybe we get to it later. But trying to achieve perfection, what is the byproduct result of manufacturing perfection in society or for a person's mental health? Because one of our, and we can even ask it now, but what does success and fulfillment mean to you?
It's a good question. Success and fulfillment to me, really, what I've been chasing, right, with everything I do is just freedom of time, right? So I would like to just dictate what I want to do with my time. And if I get a last minute text to come do a podcast, I can do that. And that's it, really. Like, that's above all anything else. And that time I can be chosen to be spent with who I care about, who matter the most to me. But that's it. That's all. So success and fulfillment is just having time. And that's really not that expensive if you think about it.
Elaborate on that, because I think most people wouldn't understand the lens that you're looking at that through.
Sure. So yeah. So when I was a software engineer, you get paid well as a software engineer, and every year, the more I got paid, the more I spent my time looking how to spend that money. And then I would just fill up my home with things that I don't need or don't even remember that I have or don't even use. And so you end up filling your life with all these things. And what I noticed is, especially back to music equipment, is so there's a time in my life where I bought every single guitar anyone could ever dream of, right? Like every Wish guitar I had. And I never played it. Why? Because they were super expensive. They had to be humidified. And so they just stayed in their case the whole time. And I would play my lower end guitars all the time. And then I just thought to myself, I'm like, why do I have this? I can't even like look at it. It has to be in its case. So like, what's the point? Other than just saying, I own this guitar, but I'm afraid to touch it. So it stresses, like by owning it, it stressed me out, right? And it removed, what was the actual fulfillment of music was, playing music, right? Like actually playing it, and that's the fulfillment. And so I got rid of all of them, because then that was the key that I noticed in life was I started surrounding myself with things that actually caused me more stress or took away more of my time, right? Yeah. And then when you simplified, and so the force to simplify was starting a business, right? You kind of have to lean up and be conservative with your cash. And that's when I realized, I was like, I can have everything I want in life with very little money. Like I supported my wife and I on $50K for 2 years. And we had all our needs met, right? And that was purely just cutting out we still ate out, we still did all the things we enjoyed, we still kept everything, we still worked out, all the top priorities, we still maintained. And that's when I realized, I was like, life is actually not as expensive as we make it out to be. It's just that we chase spending, thinking that by buying all these things, it will create that fulfillment or happiness, when that really is actually the opposite effect.
So how do you get intentional? Because I think there's a lot of people going back to understand this and really placing value on what's important to life. And I think even as founders, I think we also, I can let you tell your story, but like when you got to that exit, you had that money. That's part of why this podcast exists, because it's more about the process. So like, how do you find out what is of value to you, and how do you keep revisiting that so that way you're in alignment with your values?
That's also a great question. I think that takes the hardest effort, and that's to look deep within you. There's a lot, right? Like my spiritual journey just began since last year. And prior to that, unknowingly to me, I was doing the work without really knowing it, but I was healing a lot of my past traumas, right? Like, why was I chasing after all these nice guitars? And it was just purely for vanity, right? It was purely for ego, just saying like, oh yeah, I own a $10,000 guitar, but can I,
what's the point? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like I play it and I can give it to someone who's even better at playing it, and they can take a $10 guitar from Walmart and still shred that thing, right? And so to me, it's like, it's not really about the equipment. It's more about, right, the talent, and that's where the intention comes in. That's where the value. It's the work. It's the work that you're putting in, and that's what really creates the end fulfillment, right? I've known so like how many, this guitar music equipment. That's one thing. I see this in like skiing and snowboarding, where I have lawyer friends and they live in California, right? But they come out here, they have the nicest top of the line gear, and they're going down greens. right? And they're falling, and I'm like, this gear's like,
What's the point?
yeah, like this is too technical for you. Like you don't even know what this carbon fight. I don't even know what this is. Like I don't even know what this means. And I'm like, why do you need it? And for them, it's just like, well, I want the best. And it's like, well, okay, but your like skill level is like nowhere near that.
Yeah, I think we want what we want, but we don't figure out why we want it. You just need to ask why 5 more times.
Yep.
Well, I want the best. Why? Because I have the money to purchase it. Why? Well, it makes me look better. Well, why do you think it makes you look better? It's like, oh, I actually don't know anybody in Utah. I don't give a damn about that. But you have to keep asking it, why? So you mentioned you started down this path, you said a year ago?
Yes.
Did you say, okay. What triggered you to go down that path? And I believe you said exploring spirituality. Mm-hmm. And then what did you do so what was the triggering, like the first thing that says, I need to go do this? And then what were the action steps that you started taking to go down that?
Right. Yeah. So I'm all about mastery. So I used to be a bodybuilder, if you could believe it, back in the day.
Dude, I'm seeing those guns right there, dude.
And so, right, I mastered the body. That's all I did in my 20s was like I mastered my body. And then the next after I realized I was like, okay, I have all these vanity muscles and I still get exhausted pipetting. What's the point of these muscles if I can't even pipette? In a lab, like carrying this like 0.1 pound thing, just doing this over, and you're like, wow, like what's the point?
How much more mass did you have on you during your?
So I was about 30 pounds heavier, and I was like lean, so I was probably sub 7% body fat,
Wow.
and like crazy stats. Like I think my bench was at like 500 pounds, and
I'm going to go check out some pics, dude.
Like I was obsessed, right? Like holidays, you would see me in there, like counting every single calorie, like, and they got to a point where, I would do basic things, right? Like backpacking, and I would still get exhausted. My buddy would outwalk me who's nowhere near shape. And I'm like, then I realized I was like, oh, I can like push a boulder off of me if it ever falls on me, but like, it's not very useful carrying like very lightweight for very long periods of time. So I stopped that. And then the next was mastering the mind, right? And so that was actually when I started chasing nootropics and other plant medicine type products to help regain elasticity within my mind. Because I realized, a lot of this happens to us after school is we kind of stop learning. If no one's forcing you to learn, you just kind of stop and you become very, it just kind of day-to-day stuff. So that was the next thing. And the reason why was, so all the way up to Credo, I had a 10-year journey of acquiring skills. I always knew I wanted to start up a tech startup, but I was like, oh, I need skills. And so, I learned electrical engineering on my own. I apprenticed with a craftsman woodworker and learned everything about wood. And the last piece of that journey was software engineering. And I tried on my own, couldn't figure it out. So finally I was like, I'm going to go to school. And then I struggled because there was just this huge gap of, being out of school and then just kind of being back in. And I realized I was like, I don't have all the skill sets anymore to learn. And then I pushed myself after that point, was like, I got too comfortable, right? Yeah. And so every single class, I chose a different programming language. I always kept pushing. So by the time I was done and applying for jobs, it didn't even matter. They would ask like, oh, you comfortable with this tech stack? I'm like, sure. And if not, I'll figure it out, right? Because I'm comfortable in any language. I know how it works. The patterns are all the same. It's just the syntax that's different. And the last piece of that is the spiritual. And so master the mind, master the body, and I knew like spiritual was next. And that didn't really hit me until, so being an entrepreneur, part of it is resilience, grit, perseverance. You hear those words all the time. And in my head, I was always thinking like, do I have these? Like, I don't know. Like I have thoughts of quitting all the time. Like, does that mean I don't have grit and perseverance? And so I would talk to pro athletes and be like, what do you guys do? Like, you guys are the top of the game. Like, what do you do? And they kept mentioning these two things, like this spiritual mindset, like these two interlinked things. And they kept saying like, physically, we're all maxed out. We're all the same at this point. The thing that keeps you in the game the longest is mastering this part, right? This is where the greats spend all their time. And that's where it's all like, then I looked into like mindset coaching, right? And that's when I started learning the concepts of like, don't spend too much time in the past, don't spend too much time in the future, be present. And then you start seeing the spirit, you start getting these like repeated messages of like, be present, be present, be present. And that's where you started spirituality and all those things started clicking into place.
Okay. And then what were the first few steps that you're like, okay, I need to work on my spirituality? I mean, I think you mentioned, did you get a mindset coach? Were you just finding some online?
So I met with one, and I couldn't afford it at the time because I was living so lean. And then I couldn't tell if it was going to be worth it. But it was actually meeting other founders and other entrepreneurs that have explored and gone deep into this space, and they've done things that I've done, right, with plant medicine. That again, my utility of that was elasticity. I was just trying to make my brain spongy again, while they were exploring this whole other side. That I was just sitting there listening and being like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you experiencing? What is this road that you've gone down? And it's essentially just kind of happened almost naturally, or it just happened like as a mistake, like a byproduct kind of a thing. Like it just started happening, and then I just started adding intention to it, right? So intention into explore. And it was also this other part. So I'm non-religious, and growing up, any hint of it like freaked me out a little bit, right?
You grew up in Utah too, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so spirituality, like all that was like a little woo-y to me, and that like made me hesitant to explore, right? Because if I explored it, then that means like, oh, there's actual this is actually real, or there's like some sort of like tangible, something's true about all this, right? And that freaked me out, because what grounds me is logic, right? If math and logic can explain it, then that's the path I always go, but that's also been limiting. And so finally made the leap, and was like, okay, let's explore this other side and see what it's all about. And if it turns out to be all full of shit, we'll find out, and we've explored it, and we can come back, right? But if it's true, which, I've been reading a lot of books, and I see a lot of people, right? All the big founders you hear from, they all go through this journey, right? Like Steve, like everyone talks about Steve, and that's the same journey he went down, right? And then I started meeting just founder after founder in the Utah ecosystem, and I was like, okay, there's a pattern here. I need to start exploring this.
And do you think that underlining was everybody focusing on mindset and spirituality, or do you think it was more? Were you speaking more towards plant medicine specifically?
I think it's
or just
both.
Psychedelics.
I think both.
To not exclude the synthetic.
I think like the plant medicine psychedelics is just a way to get deeper in, right? But it's just a way to make meditating easier or more significant, because it's giving you kind of a glimpse of what it takes, years of discipline and practice to get to.
Yeah.
But it's, and the cool thing that I learned was everyone chased it for a different reason initially, but we all end up at the same endpoint, and that's kind of the magic of where it all is. And at some point, you realize the medicine has no effect, and it's time to work on the deeper parts. And it really just starts opening you up, creating alignment, really seeing what the purpose is, and everything just starts clicking into place. And no longer are you fighting all these like other thoughts and wasting energy on things that you shouldn't be wasting it on.
So what do you mean by the medicine no longer has an effect? Is you're still feeling that, but you're no longer, well, I'm not going to try to explain it because I don't know.
So
Eric goes deep, by the way.
Yeah. So the medicine, right? So, most of us, you get to a point where, you see visuals, you can't, you go into an altered state.
And for those listening, we're talking about psilocybin particularly.
Sure. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so you go into an altered, deeper state, and then eventually at some point, right? So all of doesn't matter, psilocybin, any of the psychedelics, right? That's the point of it, is it takes you deeper, bypasses all the other inhibitions and everything else that you've blockaded yourself with, and accesses your true deep self. But once you get there, well, the cool thing happens is the medicine doesn't have a purpose, really. You're already there in that state, and so it can't take you any deeper or further, right? And so when you're in that state, then it's accessible actually via meditation or breath work, and that's where the people who practice that can they're in that state all the time, right? And that's the next thing that I'm chasing after now. Is it's not really good in being that state, getting all this enlightenment and everything, and then 5 days later just being back to who you were.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that was great, but over time you lose it. But it's how do you be in that state constantly? And that's what I'm saying. When you're in that state constantly, you can take medicine at that point. It
doesn't.
Yeah,
I heard Sam Harris talk about you don't have to have the psychedelics to have that experience, but it takes a lot of practice. And so he said that's why he likes psychedelics is you can ask 100 people to meditate for 5 minutes, and 95 of them after 5 minutes are like, that was boring, and they're not going to return to it. The other 5% maybe found something interesting, and maybe they're going to stick with it. But if you give 100 people 3 or 4 or 5 grams of mushrooms, all of them will find something interesting. Yes. all of them will then be intrigued, at least a little bit, by consciousness. There's no chance that, and then it's like, okay, now keep working with it, breath work, meditation, all of that, so you can get there without the psychedelics. But it is that kind of that shortcut and like, boom, look what your mind's capable of. You can shed these other thoughts and beliefs super quickly.
Realigning with, I think that's what happens, right? I flagged exactly the pinpoint in my life where I lost myself, right? It was right between 6th and 7th grade, that transition, I lost who I was, and I became this other version of me all the way up until my 30s. Wasn't until I found realignment with myself again, right? And then that entire period, everything, didn't matter what I did, it was really hard to find like happiness and fulfillment in, right? It just, I kept chasing, right? And that's when I was buying all these guitars. I kept chasing things to fill it, thinking like, oh, this is what I want. This is what I need. If I get this, I should be happy, right? If I got this job, if I got this salary, and it just kept chasing, and I'm just realizing like, nope, like something's still off, and I just can't figure out what it is until that alignment happens. And then you see just once that happens, you see this magical like blossom appear out of it, right? Like it's almost like I talk about like it's like a stasis, so like the transition between like a caterpillar to a butterfly. Like that's like that's like such a critical juncture.
When you flagged that moment in time in 6th and 7th grade, what was, if you don't mind sharing, like what was it? And then did you do inner child work to go address that? Or like what did you do to acknowledge it and give it love? Or did you give yourself self-compassion? Because I think that's a big piece in acknowledging what that was.
Yeah, so prior to 7th grade, I was very imaginative, very creative, and actually very entrepreneurial. I would build and invent all sorts of things, right? And it got to a point then where adults were telling me, that's stupid, or like, that's not going to be anything, right? Giving you all this negative feedback, or like, oh, that idea is not going to go anywhere, or you can't do that, and just starting to give you limitations. And so that was the transition, was I just let that come in and removed who I was. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll just become a doctor then, right? Like I'm good at memorizing and studying things, and I guess that's all I can do in this life. And so from there, I just stopped thinking. I was on autopilot from 7th grade all the way through college. I never thought once about what did I want to do? What, like everything was already paved out for me, right? Like full ride, done. Got into college, and they're like, all right, you're going to be in the biology program. You're going to study these classes. You're going to do this. You'll get a minor in chemistry. You'll graduate this exact date. I didn't even talk to an advisor once in college, right? And then I showed up on the last day just to like double check, and they're like, do you have any questions? I'm like, no, like, I don't even know why I'm talking to you. Like, I already know, like, it's all ready.
There's my plan.
Yeah, it's all ready to go. Yeah, like, you have no purpose in my life. And it wasn't until that I was interviewing at med schools that I really just was the most unhappy in my life, right? I was just, every single thing took effort, right? Like, people would be excited to go be interviewing at a med school, and I was dreading it. Just like, oh, I have to like create this story of why I want to be a doctor, even though it's just all for money. And I'm meeting doctors saying like, you shouldn't do this for money. And so like, and you shouldn't do this at all, and I'm just getting like both sides of like, yeah, I kind of agree with you. And so, right. Cause then that brought up like, oh, I have no grit, perseverance, resiliency. And it's just cause I was doing the wrong thing. Like, yeah, like I shouldn't have it for that. Right. That's just like prolonging suffering. So it wasn't until finally that I decided to drop out and marry my girlfriend at the time, who's my wife now, was just like, what would you want to do? And that was the first time in my life that I finally sat down and just thought about it, right? And I was like, what is it that I want to do, right? And that's when I thought like, oh, I play music, I like it, so maybe I should be a musician. And I tried that and realized I took something really dear and magical to me spiritually and tried monetizing it, which is like the worst thing you could possibly do, and ruined it for myself, right, for years. So yeah, I'm rambling. I don't even remember what the original question was.
Well, I think you crushed it, whatever the question was. I mean, I like that you were talking about your story with you're just on autopilot. And I felt like just this last week, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, I was doing a meditation and I did some hape. And it was probably a song that I was listening to or something. And it came to my mind, I was like, people supporting you. And I was like, nobody supported me in these pivotal life decisions when one was dropping out of college, one was selling door to door, one was buying dirty dough. I'm looking back and like, not one of my family members was like, that's a good idea. It was usually the opposite. And then I'm like, man, poor me. And then I looked into it a little bit more and I'm like, no, they were just trying to help me. They just were doing the best they can. And it was like, well, I'm grateful for that they tried. But I was a little sour at that because I think I experienced something very similar of like, why didn't these guys, it feels good to be like, told you so. But I'm like, I don't want to say told you so at this point.
No, yeah,
because they had good intentions. They were just trying to get me, because I was also on the path to be a doctor as well.
Nice.
And for them, that was a safer path for me. So they wanted to encourage me to do that and not drop out.
I love safety.
So thank you. So that's exactly it. Was same exact thing was, I had a lot of built up trauma from all of that, right? And then it really just came down to framing and perspective of realizing, my family did that out of love. And so it wasn't out of, I shouldn't hold on to this hostility and resentment. Like they wanted the best that they saw for me, right? And then that's actually the key to a lot of this healing is just the framing and perspective, right? Of if you frame it like, is that all love? Then the trauma's healed.
Yeah.
It's absolved and you can move on, right? And you move on to the next thing that you're holding on to. And what you realize, and that's even like what I do now is, right, I can hold on to all the investors that said no to me and have all sorts of resentment. And then, or I could frame it of like, those guys weren't supposed to be part of this journey. They are not supposed to be part of this company's path, right? And as I move along the company's trajectory and I see where these investors are, it's turning out to be correct. And so it's like, now the framing is like, something's protecting me. Like something's been watching out for me, making sure I get like the right people involved. And so, it's just weird.
Which brings, I'm sure that brings a lot of gratitude. I mean, it shifts it from maybe embarrassment or shame or underperformance or why didn't these guys believe in me to, wow, I'm grateful for that.
Exactly.
I'm grateful that there's something bigger at play.
Yep.
We dealt with that early this year too. We got the finish line with an investor, like after like 6-7 months of negotiating, and it was just taking too long. And we said no.
No other options on the table.
No other options on the table. No money in the account.
Yeah.
We're just like, we can't go with you guys.
Yeah.
And then other options came within a few weeks.
Yes, exactly. And that's life. Like, and this is a pattern that I see happen over and over and over again, right? It's happening between me, you, and countless people. And that to me, that's again, another confirmation, like there's something about the spiritual, right? There's something, and I would describe these concepts and then finally someone just taught me what an aura is. And I was like, because I would just describe it as like, I have this like shield that's protecting me from like, and they're like, that's an aura. And I'm like, what's an aura? And then start learning all about that, right?
All right, well, teach us about auras. I don't know much about auras.
Auras are the energy you give off, right? And the energy you give off attracts certain energies. And then there's going to be, right, the dark and the light energies that are going to try and complement or try and take from it. But either way, it's going to disrupt like your energy flow and you'll feel it, even though you might not think it. But this happens to you all the time when you meet strangers. You get like a gut, that's your gut, right? It's your gut feeling. And it's these signals of just like you're saying, like, this is taking 6 to 7 months. Like, are you guys in or are you guys out? Like, there's something off, right? And then the conversations, and then the more you spend, the more you're just like, something is just making it this like not happen. And that's just your energy. So aura is just your energy that you're emanating, giving off. And it changes, right? And I think when you're in true alignment with yourself, it's at its most powerful and you'll attract anything you want at that point.
Did you have another question? Because I think you hit on something earlier. It segues into this was manifestation.
Yeah, that's okay. That's where I was going to go together.
Perfect.
So like, what did that, now knowing this and on the spiritual path and knowing about manifestation, some of the like basic principles of it, like what is shown to you as possible and how do you accelerate that? And how do you also be patient?
So that's, I think, yeah, the two things you said there is how do you accelerate and how do you be patient? And I think that is the key is you don't try to accelerate it, right? The key is to be patient. Like the studio, I remember waking up from a dream of owning a studio and just telling Mary, being like, oh, I had this dream of like owning a recording studio. How silly is that? Like, I would never own a recording studio. Like, why would I own one? You know, like that's nowhere near my trajectory. And then 2 years later, I owned a recording studio, and I was like, "Oh, this is weird."
Yeah.
Right. And then like every single thing, and it's gone to the point where it's almost you have to dream big, really big, because once it happens, then it's like, okay, that's it. Like, you know, and then what, right? So the dream was to have a tech startup, right? To get, you know, so prior to the tech startup, prior to Credo, I would go to Silicon Slopes. I'd see people pitch on stage, and I would be like, "Oh, I would love to be on that stage one day pitching." Right? Oh, I love to like talk. Like I would go and talk to these investors, and they could care less about me. Today, they're my investors. Yeah. Right? I was on that stage. I won those pitch competitions. Like those things of like that would be cool are like realities now, right? And I've seen this happen time and time again with so many people. And so it's just being, you know, it sounds silly, it sounds crazy, but just dream really big and then being patient on, you know, you don't know how it's going to play out. You don't know how it's going to happen. And it might take 20, 30 years before it happens. But it's just the possibility that it can is always still there.
That was something that was super scary for me to get into the manifestation or like vision boards and the first time I did it, again, I did it like during a summer sales thing. And maybe it was a year and a half, we like pulled it out and I hadn't seen it, but literally every single thing on there. We bought the house, we bought the car, we bought the whatever. And I'm like, holy shiz. maybe that does work. But I still had a lot of resistance of sharing goals with other people because I'm like, if I fail, and I kind of look at society, and this is a little negative, but it's like most people don't achieve their dreams and most people fail. I don't want to be grouped into one of those people. The chances of me succeeding, my dreams, again, if I just take the average and I assume I'm the same person, are very low. So I don't want to share those because the chances are I'm going to fail. And overcoming that was hard. But when I did, then I'm like, holy shit, anything's possible. Like, I don't know what's holding everybody else back from doing their dreams. And I don't know the difference, but I do know that if you actually go for it, but that was a big hurdle. I mean, I'm still trying to overcome it of like actually sharing goals and publicly or social media. Because once you put it out there, it's holding yourself accountable.
Yeah, well, and there's actually a psychological phenomena of sharing it. A lot of people believe by sharing it, you've accomplished it. And so that actually is part of it, right? Is sometimes people share it too much and they think they've actually done it and then they don't actually do any of the work to actually do it anymore, right? So I see the concern there.
Because I've seen that.
Yep.
Yeah. Everybody's a big talker and I'm like, I can't be the big talker. I have to be the doer.
Yep.
So I can't talk. But once I started like sharing the goals, I mean, that's when everything started taking off of just like, this is what I'm gonna do. Doesn't matter.
Awesome.
This is what I'm doing.
So you've mastered it, right? So
I've not mastered it, but
you can like share it and then
yes.
you're going to execute.
The first time, like, and this just came up in court like 2 weeks ago with the Crumble thing. There was an email between me and a potential advisor. Anyways, and it said the goal is to have 50 stores open in 5 years. And that was a year and a half ago. Okay. You know, when we've sold 350 stores and 20 of them are already open. And I was like, well, that was my goal at the time. And that seemed lofty. Like that took guts for me to type that into an investor to say, I'm going to have 50 stores open within 5 years.
Yeah.
Or an advisor. And then looking at how that changed and the goals. Anyways, it was very hard for me to start. And then the goal was, okay, well, maybe we'll do 100 our first year. Then, hey, I think we can actually sell 200 our first year. And then we hit like 290 or something like that. Anyways, all of those, every time I put it out there, it causes a little anxiety.
Yeah.
Causes a little anxiety. But then it happens. And I'm like, man, there's something's working.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
I love it. Well, why don't we go to the next question and say, what brings you the most joy and fulfillment now?
So now it's just building with other people I want to be building with, right? So I, prior to Credo, the biggest bottleneck or hurdle I had was always finding good founders. And I think that's actually a biggest problem with a lot of early entrepreneurs, right? And that's just because you don't have a network yet. You're just surrounded by friends and family and Those are probably the worst people to be building something with. But as you start growing, right, and your energy, your aura is starting to track all these other people, right? Like I was just telling Mary, I was like, I have over 6 people right now that want to build new companies. And I'm having to say no or like push it out or figure out where to, right? But it's like, I want to. Like, this is awesome because like I would love to build a company with this person. But now it's like I get to say no and I get to be a little bit choosy, which is a really cool luxury that I have, right? Well, before I was just like, man, how do you like just keep getting burned? I keep finding like the worst founders. Like, how do I find a better one? And now it's just that's not even the problem. It's like, okay, problem is like you have too many people that want to build things. How do we fit it all in?
Yeah. I want to, at the beginning you said success to you, or success and fulfillment is that free time. And I want to see if you can separate it. Is the free time more an indication of success? And if so, where does fulfillment fit in? Because that's kind of how I'm thinking. Like, I'm successful because I have free time, but just having free time doesn't necessarily make you fulfilled. Is that when more of the business building comes, or a give back, or a...
Yeah, that's a great question. Exactly right. So yeah, success is right. So the first goal is I want time, but then the time isn't like I just want to sit on a beach all day for the rest of my life. I would go crazy. Be super incredibly bored. It really is I'm a very hyper curious person. And so it's the next thing is, so then once I have time, then it's to explore new things that I don't understand and know, right? And really getting that compounding learning factor starting to build. And then it's really just building. It's so fun to build and create things of value, right? And then that's the key of this entire equation is people chase money, but it's like if you focus on building something of value, money will always follow, guaranteed. While you go the other way, you will most likely fail because it's not strong enough for you to persevere through anything hard, right? But when it's building, it's fun. You're building things, you're creating things, you're putting together to build something that's never existed before. You're understanding the dynamics, and that to me can be as small. Like that to me is just like as fun as like building Legos. Yeah, like it's like
same way.
Yeah, it's like and then you just take it bigger, and you're like we're just building companies now.
Yeah. So you have success is defined with now I have free time, the amount of free time, and then fulfillment is what you're doing with that free time, which sounds like creativity, building, and personal progression.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Awesome.
I will always be happy building, right? And that's actually what makes me the saddest is when I'm spending most of my time dealing with taxes and HR stuff and paperwork. And I'm like, this is no longer fulfilling me and I need to find someone to do this or like get this off my plate because I'm starting to get like really annoyed.
Mental health and being proactive is kind of the next question. What do you do on a daily or weekly or monthly basis rather than waiting for those lows to hit, but to be proactively on top of your mental health?
Yeah. So, I mean, basics, right? Eat well, sleep well, exercise. Those are core. You have to just rewire your habits, right? Cut out sugar. I know like it's been talked about so much, but it really is like the easiest thing or the lowest hanging fruit, right? Of just like, cut that out or lower your intake of that and you'll sleep better, all that. And then
is that processed sugars or like all sugars, like fruits and stuff?
No, yeah, mostly processed sugars, right? And so do that and then exercise, right? And exercise can be, it doesn't have to be, heavy lifting. It could be just walking around, going on a walk. Anything that just gets your blood moving and your body flowing, right? Could be even just like doing stretches. And then I've started adding meditation. And so I've been practicing Kundalini. And I'm just on a 40-day challenge right now. And all it is just doing it 5 minutes every day for 40 days. It's like, awesome. Can you do that, right? And then after I was like, oh, what do you do after 40? And they're just like, you kind of just keep doing it. Like the 40 was just to get you like on the habit. Yeah. And then I was like, oh, okay. So like this would be something I do for life. Like, got it. Right. But it's just like same as exercising. Like I think a lot of people think of like, oh, I'm going to get fit, lose a lot of weight, and then just take a break. And it's like, no, you kind of have to work out for the rest of your life. Like it doesn't just stop. But it's also like you'll feel good, right? Like for me, I feel gross if I'm not sore, which is like a weird feeling. And that's when I'm like, all right, I got to go work out, got some energy to burn. That's how I stay pretty proactive.
On like the working out, when I've been most consistent recently, and it's because the trainer, it's like just 3 times a week, 30 minutes each. And I'm like, that's easy. And then like yesterday, or when did we see each other? No, it was this morning. This morning,
So
usually I
it's
don't
like-
train on Mondays, but I'm like, oh, I can go get 30 minutes in.
Yeah.
And we did 2 lifts.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yep.
And I saw Mike, so it was even better. We got to work out together. But yeah, just that consistency, because you do have to plan on doing it the rest of your life, which everybody like me, I want to fix something and be as efficient as possible so I don't have to ever deal with it.
Right. I know.
But there's no shortcuts.
Nope.
On meditation or working out or
But the
eating.
shortcut is right. So I used to have really bad dental hygiene. Like I didn't floss, right? I'm just like, oh, who flosses?
Same with 90% of Americans.
And it wasn't until like my PI at the lab, and he's in his 70s, and he's like, one thing I wish I did was I wish I flossed. He's like, you're gonna have so many problems. You have so many problems when you get older. And then that day I was like, all right, I'm gonna floss every single day from here on out. Like, I don't want to deal with that. And so that's it, right? It's like by being proactive, yes, it sucks because it requires this daily thing, but you're avoiding all these long-term problems that everyone else has to deal with, right? I'm seeing people my age already. I'm like, you guys are like living like you're 50 already. Like you're so out of shape. Like things are so hard. And I'm like, this is not like where you should be in your 30s. And for me, I'm like, I don't even want to be there when I'm 50. I want to like look amazing when I'm 70, 80, 90. Like I want to be like, there's people like, I hear of like the Wyoming cowboys. And there's a story that we were being told where like this 75-year-old cowboy, they go out, it's bison hunting season, group of like millennials take one down, took 4 of them to cut it up and haul it all out. This cowboy did it by himself and he was 75. I'm like, I want to be that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I a lot of the resistance for me to commit to doing anything for the rest of my life, like I didn't, anyways, a few different examples, but it's just, am I really committed to, like, do I want to do this? Would it be better to maintain my hair or just shave it off? It's better to shave it off, but before like I'm just going to give the treatments a try, and I'm like doing these massages in the shower, and now it's like a relaxing routine. I was like, I could for sure do this. And as you said, flossing, I'm like, I need to floss. And I bet you it wouldn't be that hard if I just sit in the shower. I'm in my red light anyway, like, cause I have like a full body red light thing. I'm like, I could commit to doing a minute, 60 seconds a day for the rest of my life. And I know that minute is going to be more well spent than watching Netflix or all the other shit that I waste my time on, So I'm trying to slowly piece in these habits and tell myself, like, it's not just, I need to change my perspective.
Yep.
Because it's hard.
Yep.
But when I do, it's just like, okay, I could do it. I can do anything.
That's the cool perspective change, right? And that's the whole point of the 40-day challenge, is just recognizing like 5 minutes. You can commit 5 minutes of your day.
Yeah.
Right? And you can do that for anything. And if you just do that, these are all the long-term benefits. And that's what I do too, is I love compounding and multitasking, right? And so when I work out, I read during my, like, in between my breaks. And so it's like, okay, this is like my reading / workout time, and so I'm getting both done at the same time. Or it's like, if you're watching Netflix, do other things, right? Like you don't need to be 100% focused on whatever you're watching, because it's most likely just background.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, that's been super helpful. I mean, that's actually why I went this morning, because I was like, oh, I got a ton of texts and emails. I'll just go and when I'm by myself. But then we just ended up shooting the breeze the whole time. But it was still worth it. It was still fun.
There's still value
It's always
there.
one of those dilemmas that you sit on the machine, you're like, the people like thinking I'm not working out.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm just exhausted,
Like,
but
F off, guys.
leave me alone
Yeah.
for a second.
You showed up.
I want to get to, as we kind of go towards the end of this, I want to talk a little bit about Credo and kind of the bigger purpose that you're incorporating into what you're doing with the company, and the possibility or the chance that it has to save and enhance human lives. So I think that's really important, is like, as you're building, having purpose, and talk a little bit about that, what that means for you.
Yeah. So I have multiple companies. I have a recording studio. I have a coffee roastery company called Logos, and Credo is the plant tech company. And all 3 of those, definitely, I have passion in all of them. But when you have purpose, that really takes you to another level, right? And so when we talk about grit, perseverance, resilience, if you have something bigger than you, that is where that source of energy comes from, right? And if it's purely, right, like sometimes I question, I'm like, oh, I could have chosen an easier path that could have gotten me a lot more money faster. But then I ask myself, would I be fulfilled or enjoy doing that? And I'm like, no, I would hate every single minute of it.
Yeah.
And I would probably like be like, oh, I don't know why I'm doing this. Like these dollar signs are not worth the like energy I'm putting into this, right? And so with Credo, so I wasn't like, plants are new to me, right? I only am in tune with plants just because of, or gotten deeper into plants just out of curiosity. And so I got into it and then realizing like, oh, plants are part of everything, like everything we've talked about, right? Plant medicine, like food, it's life.
Yeah.
And then what just freaked me out was just seeing how disconnected we have become as a society with nature. And that's when I noticed, oh, like there's no data and then there's no money. Like no one's investing in plant research anymore, which is also crazy to me, right? And because we're talking about like going to Mars and doing all this stuff, I'm like, what are you gonna do there? Like you need plants. Yeah. And we don't know anything about plants, so what are you gonna do, right? And then coming from a biological world, what it helped in loving tech, it helped me see a cool relationship, and it's pretty much that the tech is all human built, and we suck at building things. Everything we build has a really high failure rate, has really horrible tolerances, has horrible precision, right? And if you apply those same numbers to the biological, we would all be like dead. Our DNA would be super mutated. We couldn't do anything, right? And so when you look at that, you're like, oh, nature's done a really good job figuring all this stuff out, right? Like I love giving an example of storing data. We take an entire mountain, entire state to store all the world's data right now, when you can have a vial, an Eppendorf tube with only couple microliters, and that can store the equivalent amount of the world's data, right? But that's on DNA.
Crazy. Yeah.
That's crazy, right? Like I can hold in my hand the world's data, but right now the way we do it is it takes up all the space. Like transferring data, for example. Like if we transfer data in our body the same speed we transfer in the real world, the way we do it, like we would like break down, like nothing would work. And it's just like, to me, it's like, okay, what are we doing here? And so it's really understanding and leveraging biology better and then building off of that, right? Just taking what's already been built and then just understanding it better and then using it. So to me, like solar, for example, is great, but it's also really inefficient compared to plants, right? Like it requires a lot of raw metals and materials. It breaks down over time. If it gets covered in snow, but imagine if you had a plant roof and you can extract energy from that. It's regenerative. It would heal itself, it would grow itself, it would hold water, it would do like all these things, and you would never think about a roof ever again, right? You're just like, oh, that's like my patch of yard up there. Yeah. Like what? And so that's what Credo, that's why I have so much drive, fulfillment, and intent and purpose with Credo, is that's what we're chasing after. We're just chasing after understanding plants better so we can leverage them and create a better future where it's integrated deeper into our everyday lives.
That's super cool. And I think, far out, one of the things that I've enjoyed talking to you and maybe Chris a little bit about is like, what does the future look like as humans become less dependent on concrete structures and we start focusing more on what matters? So it becomes more focused on plants, interactions, nature, and technology kind of takes a backseat, or it's integrated differently in our lives. I think that's a big component that I've always found interesting.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing, right? And this is something you see in business too. But it's funny that I just made that connection to business. But right, when I build things, I build them to be self-sustaining ecosystems, right? So I just built a planted aquarium. That tank is going to have blue lotus in it, and
cool.
The blue lotus is maintained by the shrimp. The shrimp are keeping the algae in play. The axolotl is eating the shrimp. The axolotl is what generates the waste to feed all the plants. And so when it's built and maintained, I'm no longer a part of the equation anymore, right? I don't have to be there anymore. This thing can maintain itself forever, right? And that's the same thing as when you build businesses. That's kind of the goal too, is you want a self-sustaining community. You don't want, like, you create it and then you're like, cool, I can step away from it, right? So now imagine a future where we just become reintegrated with nature, right? Like we're part of nature. We just kind of have the ego of like, oh, we could do better. We're smarter and we can do things differently, but it's burned us a lot. Like we create a lot of damage. We cause a lot of damage. We make a lot of mistakes. That's just part of who we are as humans. But if we integrate, then all of a sudden everything just goes back into balance, and no longer is it this like we're consuming and just destroying a planet. It's like, oh yeah, the planet provides enough. Like you just need to be less wasteful and more efficient with everything, and you don't need, right? Like think of, like, we were just talking about this concept with another group last week of imagine, so we have all these commercial buildings. They're empty. No one wants to go to them. Why? Because they're just like awful places to be. Like who wants to spend all that time in there, right? But now imagine if like it had a ton of plants in it. And not only that, but like the 10th floor of this building was a park. Now it's like, oh, well, now it shifts because like I'm now like reconnected to nature and that does seem better to me, right? And that I can be like my work environment, my living environment is now closer integrated with what brings like, for me, going to the desert is one of the best healing things you could do, right? Like just like disconnecting, being out there, getting your hand in dirt and just like, you know, feeling the sun and just not worrying about anything other than just like, what am I doing today? Like, and that's like what I love about backpacking is my priorities shift just down to, I need to make food. I need to go like get some water, get some shelter up, make fire, and that's it. And then like, I'm done.
Or just wander around.
And like the rest is just like I can sit here and think or stare at the lake or like go watch some animals or do whatever. But like that's it. Those are like my 5 top priorities that I need to take care of, and I'm done, right? And that's life too. Is like we just get so overwhelmed with everything that we think is so high priorities, and everything's like fighting for it. But it really comes down to like a couple of things that really matter.
I agree.
That's awesome. Last question for you.
Okay.
How do you want to be remembered?
Ooh. That's a good question. I don't even know if I want to be remembered. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. Yeah. You know, I guess for the people that are close to me, it's, you know, I did everything right by them. You know, I would love to, as hard as I can, be in this world ego free. And if I can accomplish that, that's good enough for me.
Love it. Sweet, man. Well, where can our listeners connect with you?
LinkedIn's always a great place. That's probably the only social media platform I'm on. Otherwise, if you know you want to talk, feel free to email me. I think I give you all my links, so that'll be posted somewhere. Yep. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. What a great conversation this was.
That was fun.
As bonus content, let's ask him our most controversial question.
Ooh.
Do we have free will?
No.
Hell yeah, my man. My man.
Explain. And this is why explain and elaborate.
So if you
and everything's open here.
Yeah.
Now.
So if you do believe in spirituality, then there's almost this concept that you're on a path.
Correct.
And if you're on a path, then you don't have a free will, right? You can't get off the path. You can't. I mean, you can get off the path, but just a different path that's got a whole other path ready to go. So I don't think, I think that's a concept that we would love to have, but I don't think there's anything that supports that we actually have it. And if we do think we have it, it's an illusion.
And then where does responsibility play in? Because if we don't have agency or free will, how do we be good stewards and how do we make the most of this lifetime?
So I think that's what is up to you at that point, right? So I think by being more aligned and by, living better amongst everyone else, you'll be on a better path.
Yeah.
And then if you're being, very greedy, taking, you'll be on a very selfish, gross path that because that's like what I've also been thinking into is what's why? If you can just be bad, why? Why would you be good, right? Yeah. But I think on those paths, it's very lonely, right?
Which is a bad path. Yep. I mean, selfishly, you need to be on a good path. You need to selfishly help others, to selfishly build relationships, to selfishly be happy.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you look, I love watching Alone, right? So Alone's like ultimate survivor, right? Mm-hmm. You're out there on your own, 100 days. Everybody on that show can survive. Everyone builds shelter. What's the one thing that brings them all down? Being alone. That's it, right? That brings them down. All of them to their knees. All of them. Every single one, to the point where they're just there's no point in this life if you're just this is it. There's no point.
Interesting.
Good curveball, though.
I kind of like this bonus question. We should document everybody that comes through.
Yeah, I would love seeing that. Because I thought for a long time, I was you have to have free will, right? You have to have that. And then
you examine it, but it's not there.
Yeah.
Well, it makes you.
But also, there's really not anything we could say about responsibility. I mean, it's just you are on your path, and to complete that path, I mean, that's what it is. If you're a bad person, you're a bad person. If you're a good person, you're a good person. It's all perspective anyway. Mm-hmm. But how do you have responsibility with that? And
that's a good point. Yeah, because that's another
it really does take away responsibility, but it also takes away shame and guilt and hate and ego and pride You know?
That's the key. Those things, getting rid of those things. Because I love that. Because like that's what I've been looking at. Is like, what's a bad person? And a bad person, if you look over time, is getting redefined all the time.
Sure. All the time.
And so it's just like, just if you were born like 2 decades ago, you'd be fine. But today you're in this era, and now you're like the worst person in the world. Like that sucks. But I'm like, that's weird, right? Because now we fast forward 30 years, you might be a good person again. Like and like that's kind of messed up. And so what are these bins that we're putting people into, right? And that's exactly what is good and bad. Like that's
just perspective.
Yep. And so like that to me is like good and bad actually need to be redefined or framed. And that comes back to just yin and yang now, right? Of like, okay, we know like there's energies in play that keeps things in balance, but what we define as good and bad, success and fail, those are all the wrong words that we're using. Because all it does is it just compartmentalizes you in a place like, so right, if you say good, then bad has to exist. If you say success, then failure has to exist, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't say any of those, then
It's
they
just
don't.
experience.
Exactly.
Consciousness and experience.
So where do you think we started? Because I believe that we don't have free will in this like human lifetime because a lot of it was predetermined spiritually. Where do you think that was, and how do we is there potential to alter that in the quantum of being able to go back in and make edits to those paths?
I think so. Yeah. So now it's down to
Well, that's free will. You're changing your mind, Eric. Get on my
is
side or
that
get
free
off
will?
of it.
Is that free will, or is that just part of the path of like you
That's-
screwed up in that past life? Now you have to kind of go back and like redo it again. Like you have to do it
But
again.
if you're following the same path, there's no free will, so it doesn't really matter.
But it also goes back to what was predetermined when we came down here in this lifetime? Because was it predetermined that you were going to make those edits? That's all the questions that.
At like a molecular quantum level, there's randomness. So you can say there is not really a path, but it doesn't matter because we don't control the randomness that occurs at a freaking atomic level. So either way, it's not us consciously controlling what we're doing.
Well, I think that's the key is it doesn't really matter because you're chasing for this like end thing and the end doesn't matter. It's like the whole journey is what matters, right? So, and I think that's where we always are is we're always focusing on the end, and that's like the least significant question to be asking. So I don't know, right? But then it's also I don't spend that much time thinking about it because I'm like, it doesn't matter.
There we go. That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.